Thank you all for coming. I'm Carl Gershman. I think as many people here know, last night Nadja Duke passed away. And this is a tremendous loss for us. This is actually the first event that is being held since that happened, and that it happens coincidentally to be an event on Ukraine. So we wanted to begin by remembering Nadja. I don't know, I assume most people here knew Nadja and knew something about her contribution, but let me just say that she came to NED in 1987. She died at 64. Half her life, half her years were with NED. And during that time, she came at a really remarkable time in history when things were beginning to change for the better, and she played a very central and wonderful and important role in those changes that took place. And she continued to play a very central and important role, not just in Ukraine and Poland and Russia, but throughout the former, what had been the Soviet bloc, the former communist world, and also throughout the world. And she was a very important part of NED, and dearly beloved by everybody who knew her. Yesterday, President Poroshenko, or the day before yesterday, President Poroshenko presented Nadja with the Order of Princess Olga at the highest level. And he did it in recognition of the high appreciation of her many years of active work for the benefit of Ukraine, her personal contribution to the development and strengthening of the strategic partnership between Ukraine and the United States, and her unwavering authority both in Ukraine and among the Ukrainian community in America. We've been getting many, many messages. It's hard to single them out, and I don't want to do them here. We're going to put them on the website, but and you're all welcome to write if you want. If you knew Nadja and want to reflect upon who she was, her contribution, her character. Just a couple that came in the last hour or two, I just want to note. Ambassador John Teft, who was the U.S. ambassador in Russia recently and in many other countries, he wrote, and he just did this on his own. I hadn't even notified him of Nadja's death. And he wrote that I worked frequently with Nadja and came to admire her work in Eastern Europe. In one fashion or another, I worked with her in each of the countries to which I was accredited as a diplomat. Nadja was a passionate defender of democracy and human rights. She brought the full force of NED's programs and American support for democracy throughout the region. So many people are better off today, collectively and individually, because of Nadja's work. She had a life of real consequence, and I mourn her passing. Our wonderful friend, Miroslav Marinovich from the Ukrainian Catholic University, noted, as many others had, that Nadja was the first ethnic Ukrainian woman to receive a doctorate, PhD, from the University of Oxford. And he said, in his message that I just received, she found the place in her heart for the two loves, that for her country, the United States, and the love for the native land of her parents, Ukraine. The problems of the latter always resonated in her soul. And he said that, our dear, dear friend, Miroslava Gongadze, was with Nadja at the end, helping her. And he said that in her last interview, which she gave to Miroslava, she said, I had a wonderful life. Miroslav Marinovich said that we express our gratitude for this life to God, who blessed her life roads, and to Nadja herself, who took the side of good and had never given up, and let her soul rest in peace. And the NED is coming out with a release now, and in that release, her dear friend here at NED, Barbara Haig, commented on her calm grace with which she fought the good fight during this battle with cancer that she had, and also for nurturing younger generations of democratic activists throughout Eurasia and helping them to define and find constructive ways to work toward achieving their dreams. Nadia wrote a book about youth activists. She had a special interest in this, and she felt that they played a critical role in all of the stages of the Ukrainian revolution, from the different stages, from the downfall, the separation from the Soviet Union, to the Orange Revolution, to the Euromaidan, and so forth. And Barbara said that she demonstrated so much courage these last 2 years of struggle. She uplifted and inspired us all, and we loved her, and we will miss her. It is my understanding that the funeral will be next Thursday, when there will be another opportunity to remember Nadia. There'll be many opportunities to remember Nadia, to honor her, to convey our love for Nadia. And at this time, I just want to call for a moment of silence as we think about her and remember her. Thank you very much, and the program can get started.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. Thank you, Carl, for that touching tribute. I remember Nadia fondly, and you paid her justice with that. I'm Dean Jackson. I'm an assistant program officer with the International Forum for Democratic Studies, sort of the research and conferences arm of the National Endowment for Democracy. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's presentation, The Struggle to Achieve Public Media Reform in Ukraine, featuring reagan-fascell Democracy Fellow Kyrylo Loukerenko, with comments from Joanna Rohozinska, Senior Program Officer for Europe here at the Endowment. Funded by the U.S. Congress, the reagan-fascell Democracy Fellows Program hosts some of the world's most dedicated democracy activists, scholars, and journalists. And here they conduct independent research and pursue democracy-related projects at the Endowment. Now in its 18th year, the program has hosted more than 290 fellows from over 90 countries since its founding in 2001. Within this remarkable group, our speaker today stands out for his unwavering commitment to democracy and media freedom in Ukraine. In Soviet times, Ukraine's media served as a mouthpiece for state interests. Since the country's independence, reform efforts have focused on strengthening the integrity of public media. Following the Euromaidan protests, these efforts culminated in legislation officially transforming the state broadcaster into a public service outlet. Today, conflicts of interest, inadequate financing, and insufficient political will threaten the future of public media in Ukraine. A hotspot for Russian information warfare, Ukraine's public media has an essential role to play in providing the public with relevant, fairly reported, and undistorted information. Today, Kyrylo will discuss the role of public media in Ukraine's democracy and the challenges it faces to becoming a strong and stable institution. Kyrylo is the executive director and co-founder of Hromadski Radio, which is Ukrainian for public radio. Hromadski is a leading public news broadcasting service that provides timely and balanced news on current affairs in Ukraine. From 2012 to 2013, he worked at TVI TV channel, one of the few voices of responsible journalism at that time, serving as editor of a weekly TV magazine and co-presenter of the daily show Znaka Kliku, which is Ukrainian for exclamation mark, covering, among other topics, Ukraine's widely criticized 2012 parliamentary elections. In the early 2000s, he worked as a producer and special correspondent for the BBC's Ukrainian service in London and Kyiv. Joanna Rohozinska is NED's senior program officer responsible for Northern Europe, which includes Ukraine. She has been engaged in programs in the post-communist space for 19 years, living and working in a number of countries in the region prior to joining the Endowment 10 years ago. She holds a graduate degree in Russian and European history from the University of Toronto, where she focused on nationalism and foreign policy issues within the Russian and Soviet empires. I'm now going to turn things over to Kyrylo, who will speak for about 25 minutes, followed by Joanna's comments for about 10 minutes. If you'd like to take part in this discussion on Twitter, please do so. You can do that through the hashtag NEDevents, or by following the forum @ThinkDemocracy. If you've not already done so, please take a moment to silence your cell phones Nothing more embarrassing than an unwanted cell phone call in the middle of a public event. And finally, I want to take this opportunity to thank all of the Endowment staff who were involved in bringing this event to fruition. That's especially Research Associate Jeremy Langlois, who offered vital assistance to the fellowship project and to today's presentation. And with that, Kyrylo, the stage is yours.
Yep, thank you. I'm really thrilled that so many people came to this presentation, and first of all, I wanted to thank Ned for giving me this opportunity to present actually my opinion on how the situation with Ukrainian public broadcasting, public media could be improved. For me, it's a kind of moment to review what's happening with us in Ukraine and what we can improve in relation to public media. Nadia Duke was remembered during this presentation, and actually what you see during this presentation, I hope it will develop actually the vision of Ukraine which Nadia Duke had. So let me start from short overview of what you will hear today. Actually, I will start from some introductory notes, because some people are not very deep in the situation with Ukrainian public media. It's quite a specific topic. Then the major part of my presentation will be devoted to the Ukrainian public broadcasting company, which is public service broadcaster, which is the most important actor among Ukrainian public media. So two parts will cover the situation with UA-PBC, as it calls itself. And finally, I will stop at the alternative non-commercial media, which I represent. So we are starting from the background. 30 years ago, the situation with Ukrainian media was very, very simple. It was all state-controlled, heavy censored media, mostly subordinated to Communist Party. It has special institution, Glavlit, which censored everything that was printed or broadcasted. In 30 years time, we have very drastic changes. We have private media, which in terms of audience, which dominates Ukrainian media sector. And unfortunately, well, there are many different private media. Some of them, they are really see public interest as their beacon, as their orientation. But mostly, they are dominated by oligarchs, and it leads to some erosion of public discourse, I would say. There is a small part of Ukrainian media sector which belongs to public media. I would actually, that block should be a little bit smaller, but I was afraid that the characters would not fit the block, so it's a little bit bigger than actual influence of public media in Ukraine these days. So why actually do we need public media in Ukraine? Because I think this is the media, this type of the media is the natural ally for democracy. And it's important because of all those reasons, but I will say that it enforces both democracy and market. And it enriches discourse, and it settles new industry standards, actually, for broadcasting, for media in Ukraine, because other commercial and oligarchic media, they have some kind of sample. They can just see, and they can compare what they do with some other work which is done by other people. So let me return to the picture you already seen. Actually, this is Kiev in its most marvelous time of the year. It's I believe it's May or June, and it's very nice picture. And you know, this is usually when you see this picture, first of all, you see that broadcasting tower, which is actually this a symbol for the Ukrainian broadcasting. And actually, when you see it closely, you see another structure on the background, which is even more important because this is actually the headquarters for the Ukrainian public broadcasting company. And this is actually the example. I deliberately brought this picture here because when you zoom closer, you see this building. It's a kind of symbol for what is going with the Ukrainian public media right now. It was planned in 1960s. It was still heavy censored communist organization, media organization. The building itself, actually, it was designed for Cuban broadcasting company in Havana, and it's really during the summertime. It's very convenient. It does not need conditioning, but during the winter and in Ukraine, it's a little bit uncomfortable there. So it was built for 9 years. This is not usual. You know, in Soviet times, it usually did not take so much time to build such a construction. But it was the very end of the Soviet Union, and actually that's why it was a little frozen, and they started again. And now we have this beautiful structure inside of which this Ukrainian public broadcasting company is located. However, when you come closer to this building, you see that it's not actually finished. And when you see it on the left and on the right, you see that actually the entrance to the building, the major entrance, it should be like, according to the plan, it should be marvelous. But still it's concrete blocks and something like that. So I think this is a metaphor about what's going on with the Ukrainian public broadcasting. It started it was designed in 1960s. It was built in 80s and 90s, and it's not finished. When this lady, I met her a month ago. She's the head of the Ukrainian of the supervisory board. She's Tatiana Lebedeva. She's a volunteer. She does not get money for this. And she's very important because on her depends actually many things for this company. And when I came to her, and my image of the company was like, I just presented you. And when I asked her, what is your opinion? What happened with this? What is the result of transformation or intermediary result of transformation? She said that it's a success. And I was a little bit astonished, but when she explained it to me, I agreed, and I think you would agree with me. This is the timeline. She told me about this story, and actually it did not start even 1991 when Ukraine became independent. It started in 1997 with the first law on the public broadcasting in Ukraine. It was never it was approved, but it was never helpful, and it was never used as a working law. It was abandoned, actually. So in those 30 years, nothing happened until 2013 or 2014. During this time, three groups of journalists, they started public broadcaster on their own without waiting that huge former state machine of broadcaster would be transformed into public service medium. So, but after the Euromaidan, actually, everything happens, and the Parliament approves the new law, the supervisory board formed, and actually the board formed, and actually the company started to operate. So starting 2014, things changed dramatically, I would say. Now, short outlook. What we have now? We have 28 TV and 28 radio channels. Why so many? Because they include local, regional channels and some central channels. Actually, it's quite a big employer, and it employs 4,500 people. It used to employ twice more, and actually they are trying to contract the workforce because it's too many people for them. And finally, you see the budget. It's about $35 million US, which is, according to the estimations from the company and according to some independent opinion, which is, I would say, hardly enough for such a company. So now we are coming to the challenges. From that figure of 35 millions for that size of company, we came to that nice guy who is actually in charge of that company right now. He's Zurab Alasania, who is ethnic Georgian, and he is in the Ukrainian national shirt here. So when I met him in September, I was doing interview for my research, and actually I asked him, I started to ask him about some, asking him about some visionary things and major issues, and actually he told me that actually we're running out of money. And that was his most important message for that day in September. And actually, it eventually finished that in that the company sent their employees on unpaid vacations in December. So some of them were on unpaid vacations, some of them were employed for a couple of days during the week, some of them worked as volunteers. So that was a picture how the company operated at that time. This is the first challenge, I would say. I would start with the editorial independence. This is the picture of religious procession of July of 2018, last year. The major public TV channel decided not to run this procession live because it decided that it don't want to cover the situation, the religious procession of one church, because there are other churches in Ukraine. And the day before that procession, another religious procession happened, and it did not cover it either. It was covered in the news, but it was not live for many hours. But many people demanded, including some politicians, and you see the president is here, and you see the church leaders and some high officials, including Minister of Defense here. And after that decision, a public broadcasting company of Ukraine was heavily criticized because from the opinion of many independent bloggers or some people who are affiliated with politicians and some politicians, it was definitely a very important event, and exactly this particular procession should be covered extensively, all, I don't know, 3 hours of this or something like that. So these are the issues which public broadcasting company faces these days. Another issue is it's about politicians. And it's another picture. And it's about conference on public broadcasting run by a Council of Europe. It was done in October. And the most important person on that picture is a man with mustaches who, during the conference, he's a member of the Ukrainian parliament. He raised and said that Public Broadcasting Company of Ukraine spends huge amounts of money for nothing. They actually embezzle the money. They abuse that budget they receive from the state budget. And actually, they should be changed. The leadership of the public broadcaster should be changed, and the Western and the European supporters should revise their attitudes towards the current leadership. And then Zurab Alasania, whom you saw a couple of slides ago, raised and said, I'm sorry, but this man, he is in conflict with the public broadcaster, because that particular member of parliament, he is associated with a private TV channel that shares the same broadcasting frequency as public broadcasting channel. So they are in a legal dispute about that frequency. That's why that man raised his opinion during that conference. And this is a very good example how Ukrainian politicians are involved in commercial media. And this is very well presents their attitude to public broadcaster. Because there are 450 members of the Ukrainian parliament, and some of them related to other private channels. Some of them own other private channels. And even the president of Ukraine, he is associated with a number of TV channels. He is the owner, but he distantiates himself from the managing those channels. However, still this is a fact. So this is the situation with the people who actually assigned the budget for the Ukrainian public broadcasting company. And as a result, we see last year the budget, actually I need to explain you this. The law obliges that public broadcasting company of Ukraine should receive a certain proportion, tiny proportion of the entire state budget. However, and last year it should receive about 1.5 billion Ukrainian hryvnias. However, it received roughly half of that. And this year it received again about 55% of the sum they needed. So basically that was the situation with challenges, and now it's about solutions. I'm writing a policy paper, a research on this, and it will be ready in about 3 weeks, and hopefully I will present it in February, and we can send it to those who are interested. And it will be published in English and in Ukrainian. However, those are the most important points I would want to mention. That public broadcasting law needs to be changed. Maybe another mechanism of financing needs to be introduced. The financing must be full and timely issue, and they need to solve the issue of debts of public broadcasters, and also they need to solve issues of property, because it owns a very significant number of buildings which are simply corrupting, and they do not have enough budget to even service all the property they operate. However, they are not able to sell the property because the state is the owner. So other sources of revenue must be considered. And very important part of those proposals, organizational issues are to be solved about the structure of the organization, about the management of the organization. And also, other issues are, they need to improve the content. And in order to improve the content, they need to attract the best content in the country. They have to receive right to acquire content. I would say that at the moment, the public broadcaster faces so many restrictions imposed by the state. They have, for example, this month, they have a revision commission. They came and they tried to study how they spend the money, and they have to discuss every hryvnia they spend. And this is an enormous hardship for the people who are trying to operate on that small budget, and who are trying to do something in terms of producing good content. And also, they need to increase their presence in the internet. So basically, that would be the end of my presentation. However, there is one more point I would want to make today. There are other organizations which are, I would say, might be very helpful to support the public broadcaster, but wider, it can support public opinion in Ukraine. It can help to understand the situation better from the point of view of the public. The man here is my colleague. He is Andrei Kulikov. He's a very professional journalist. He spent many years with the Ukrainian BBC service, and he is the head of the board of my organization, which is Hromadske Radio. This is one of those organizations which exist. We do not have access to the state budget, and actually we are among those other actors which may be helpful, because still the public broadcasting company is the most important actor in promoting public interest in democracy in the Ukrainian media, but there are some other organizations. And I would say that the success of public media is in creative of the environment where a number of actors operate. They should support each other. They should compete with each other. They should make co-production. They will be able to exchange with the professionals. And actually, when you have more than one public and community or non-profit media in Ukraine, you have a better safeguard against censorship, because we have some other examples, including Eastern European countries, where some governments, they are tempted to impose censorship on public media. And when you have one only public service broadcaster, they simply replace its management, and you are back 30 years ago to state-controlled media. When you have this environment, you have natural safeguarding mechanism against such decisions. So basically, this is what I wanted to tell you today, and this is basically the end of my presentation. this is our team, Hromadske Radio, so I put it deliberately here because they support me here while I'm in the United States and love those people. So you can contact me, those are my details. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Ned, for helping me to produce such a presentation. And I hope I will produce more, and if somebody is interested, I will send you my report, which will be done later. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kyrylo. That was great. That was a very insightful, thorough, thoughtful, well-presented overview of the topic. I'm going to turn now to Joanna, Ned's Senior Program Officer for Northern Europe, whose opinion on Ukraine I respect immensely, having worked here for several years. I think of her as one of, if not the most knowledgeable people I know on the country, and she's going to offer about 10 minutes or less of comments before we go to broader public discussion. Joanna?
I think that's the most daunting introduction I've ever gotten, but thank you very much. And just kind of as a nod to Nadia, it was a great, how'd you say, honor and privilege that she actually handed the Ukraine portfolio over to me several years ago, which I always appreciated her trust and faith in this. Much like, so on one hand, yes, thank you to Kyrylo. We've had also the privilege of helping Hromadske Radio out for the past couple of years through our small grants program, which I'll return to a little bit later. But much like the building of the national broadcaster is a bit of a symbol of the situation of the broadcaster itself, much the entire situation is symbolic of the tremendous challenges that Ukraine faces writ large since the Maidan and trying to go through its reforms. To put a bit of a context on both the budget and the challenges that the state broadcaster faces in its transition, there are currently over 1,500 broadcast licenses, and I'm just talking about television broadcast licenses in Ukraine. Over 1,200 of them are private, and only 298 are community-owned and 36 state. I think that the annual budget for the public broadcaster amounts to a holiday home of one of the oligarchs that owns the private stations. So just to put this in context as to what they're up against, really, and far more streamlined. Audiences in Ukraine, much like everywhere, switch for the entertainment and maybe stay for the news. And so the whole idea of content creation is also incredibly difficult. There was some hope in February 2014, when there was a bill that was passed requiring full disclosure of ownership of the broadcast of the TV stations. But unfortunately, it tended to verify what people knew anyways and didn't actually make anybody switch the channels, as they understood who owned the television stations and what the political games involved were, but somehow did not necessarily inspire them to switch to another channel or demand higher quality or demand a balanced view of things. Out of the 10 main television channels, the most popular one only retains 10% of the audience, and the rest are split below that. One thing that Kyrylo didn't mention is that it's an uphill battle, that currently the viewership of the state broadcaster is within the margin of error. So they're fighting back from maybe a 2% viewership, I think sometimes hovering around 1%, to try and compete against much larger, much better funded private stations. Since January 2018, there's about I'll skip that back. Right now, apparently somewhere the public broadcaster is about in the 25th of the national broadcasters. So it really is an uphill battle. If you're looking at media in general in Ukraine, it faces a lot of the same problems that media does writ large, which means that it's a game of pop culture rather than quality. And so where you kind of put your balance and where you put your funding. For the donors involved in media development, so just to be clear, NED is not a media development organization per se, but Ukraine is one of our biggest small grants discretionary programs that the Endowment has. It's regularly in the top 10 and increasing over the past couple of years. media has been a larger portion of our budget. Since 2018, we've funded about 20 media projects in Ukraine. And the challenge for us is always how to deal in this giant ocean of need. Where do we position ourselves to try and figure what we're going to have the greatest impact on? So we have decided to pick boutique programs, as it were, a little bit like Hromadske Radio. But for the most part, the vast majority of our support goes to media projects in the regions, particularly. And they're usually underserved regions, or they're ones that are particularly vulnerable either to Russian disinformation or under the full control of a single, not even an oligarch, say, but we call them oligarchiki. So even it's like a local large businessmen that tend to own the regional stations and media across the entire region. So we try and level the playing field a little bit by sticking our nose into those kind of programs. There's a lot of funding that does go in to support Ukraine, and I think that it's the challenge for all of us to figure how to make the biggest difference to help them turn the corner in this. A lot of it does end up being self-regulation. I think that the imposition of legislation to curtail media freedom is always a little bit problematic. There was a lot of discussion about Ukrainian versus Russian language and limiting the content to it. I think that'll sort itself out in the long run. But for Kyrylo, I'm going to close here because I'm sure he's a lot more interesting to talk to and listen to than I am. But given the scale of what they're up against in terms of trying to fight from a very back-footed position to try and take a part in the Ukrainian market, how would you see that happening? I mean, in a lot of public media, BBC is the gold standard for what's going to happen. I somehow have some doubts as to Ukrainian, with all due respect, Ukrainian public broadcaster being able to take that kind of position. But how long do you think that they have before they can kind of like come back from a back foot to have at least a more meaningful position on the Ukrainian market?
Thank you very much. And actually, I would say that you're correct about when you mentioned that small, tiny audience for the public service TV channel. But when it goes about radio channels, the situation is better with the public broadcasting channels. I would say that the radio is much more popular vis-a-vis television. And actually, their news are quite popular according to the recent research. They are I believe among the fifth best news, best listened news radio organizations. And actually, the state it supports the radio with licensing. They gave them, I would say, now they operate about 200 transmitters across Ukraine, which is, I believe, this is the largest number of transmitters in Ukraine. So when we speak about the radio, it's not so bad. And in terms of quality of the production, they still have plenty of room ahead to improve. And it's the same is about quality of production for their major TV channel and other TV channels. So they are in the middle of transformations, and hopefully they will do better. However, it depends very much on the management itself and how it could manage those scarce resources. But also it depends on how the state, who is actually the owner, how it is able to give them freedom to operate. So basically, I'm not sure this is the answer to your question, but.
Okay, well, we've got a little over half an hour, I think, for Q&A from the audience. If you would please raise your hands if you have a question. Please make sure that it is a question which ends in a question mark, and in the interest of getting in as many questions as possible, please try to be concise and introduce yourselves when you do ask a question. But I've got right now a gentleman in the front row.
Hi, Bruce Guthrie, retired government. You're talking about being in the top 5 of the radio market. Do you have a breakdown in terms of where Ukrainians get their news from as far as TV versus radio versus internet? Is the top 5 radio actually a substantial chunk?
I don't have the breakdown. I don't have figures by hand. And actually, Ukraine is a country with the people who are not able to think about their life without television. So everybody watch television, you know. So if you want to reach the widest possible audience, you have to go to a number of private commercial channels, and you will reach 95% of the audience, because this is the usual procedure. Everybody in the evening, they watch TV and they watch entertainment, and also they watch the news. So basically, in terms of audience, there is no alternative to television. The radio is quite small in comparison to that huge audience. The web audience is growing, but still, I would say I would compare it to the radio audience. But still, in terms of the mass, the television is the most important source of information for Ukrainians, and entertainment.
I think Joanna has some specifics as well.
So I think IRIX is actually a good source of it, but according to their last study, over 90% of Ukrainians declare television as their primary source of news. Radio is among the last, including, and print I think falls a little bit under that. The difficulty with radio is that there's a lot of studies been shown that people underreport because they don't think of radio as a news source, because it's what's the word I'm looking for? It's passive, right? And so they don't realize that sitting in a car for 2 hours, they've actually already listened to 4 cycles of news as they've come through. So they tend not to declare it, but as a passive source of news, it tends to be higher. It just underreported a little bit. That being said, most radio is music radio, but that being said, there is still some news that comes in.
All right, I have, let's go in the back to reagan-fascell, hello George, and then here in the middle row, there's a woman in a sort of purplish shirt, and then I see you two, and I'll get to you next.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. My name is George. Kyrylo is my fellow. I want us to stay a bit on the figures, because I think it's very important to me. If you could give a bit of context to the data the audience and viewers about. When you make reference to public broadcasting and indicate that it's just about 1 to 2% audience viewership share, can you give us a bit of context in terms of the demographics? And I ask because if the 2% are the critical influencers, then it is different from others. And precisely because this is not commercial television where eyeballs matter in terms of the extent it goes for advertising and all, I would be very interested in getting a bit of context around the figures. Thank you.
And then we'll take 2 at a time, I think, Kyrylo.
I have a question about, you mentioned that there are 28 channels of radio and TV, and are there discussions to reduce this number, and in this case to concentrate on a few channels, and then maybe money will be enough? And is there any, what's behind of keeping 28 channels, radio and TV? And the second question is, it's very important, board composition and chair of the board, and can you elaborate on that? They are under influence of any one political party. So are they biased? And are there in discussion of having change a board composition to provide more independence in terms of content?
Thank you very much. I start with a question from George. I would not, well, there are certainly some shows, some programming which is more, I would say, intellectual, and some particular stratus of the society they prefer to watch or to listen to those shows. However, in general, it's not, well, I would not say that at the moment public broadcasting company of Ukraine is a producer of such content which the more enlightened and more kind of decision-making part of the audience would not survive without, you know. So it's still, there are some examples which are very good. However, as in mass, it's not so deep. They are not able to hire the best journalists as soon as they don't have normal budget for this, you know. So they are still, there is, I believe it's about, it's a couple of more years before they would be able to create this new quality of this organization. So, and those two questions about how those many channels. It's a difficult situation, I believe, because it's about their licenses. They receive licenses. They have some obligations vis-a-vis state licensing body. They have to attain to those licenses, and also it's about it's mostly regional channels, and it's about how you cover news and events on the local level, because there is a balance between nationwide appeal and the news and events which are important for all the nation, and also you have local audience which is underserved by commercial media. So that's why they keep so many channels. They are not similar in terms of their audience and complexity of product. They are different. However, this is quite a task to manage this. They do have some problems with management, because in order to transform former state broadcaster into a public broadcaster, they centralized it. So they make I would say most of the decisions are made in Kiev right now. So and at the same time, their significant audience is in the regions and should be served by the regional divisions of that company. So this is a problem for that broadcaster, how to balance, how to make decisions, how to make editorial decisions about what news are important for people in Donbass or in Kharkiv or Odessa regions. So it's a wider issue than a number of channels. And finally, there are different boards. There is a supervisory board, and there is a board of the public broadcaster, which is a managerial body. So when it goes about supervisory board, it's politicized. It has certain proportions from different political forces, and they they come to that supervisory board, they debate, they have different opinions which correspond to opinions of political parties. They also have some quotas from civil society organizations. But the problem with this, not political influence, but the problem is that they are not paid. And when you need to assemble that supervisory board, which consists, I believe, about 17 people, usually half of them comes, or even less, because they have their obligations on their job, basically. So probably there is a task to professionalize, maybe downsize that supervisory board and make it more professional and make it working every day, you know, because now they're volunteers. They do it because they want to support this organization. However, they are connected to some political forces, of course. Basically, that's probably an answer.
Right, and then next I have the woman in the pink shirt, and behind her the man in the gray shirt.
Hi, my name is Viola Ganger. You mentioned that your top sort of priority or goal is to change the public broadcasting law. What do you feel needs to be changed about it?
Okay.
My name is Darian Diachak. I was just wondering, to what extent is foreign media actually supplanting the Ukrainian homegrown product? Because you have American media, you have international media. I imagine the people who live close to the Polish border listen a lot to Polish broadcasts. Maybe the people living close to Russia listen to Russian broadcasts. And some of these are very, very high quality. And I think Ukrainians are probably used to listening to Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. So to what extent do you think foreign media is actually the source that Ukrainians naturally go to rather than their own media?
Thank you for this question. I will start with the change with public broadcasting. Actually, I tried. There is no, I would say, a single change which I would say that this is the most important. I put my recommendations, it's a number of them, and I do believe that the state should be more helpful in terms of legal support, in terms of removing this excessive control, because sometimes they have so many instructions and so many revisions they have to cope with. I think those are two more important things which need to be done. But there are much many, and actually I would say that there is an issue of licensing frequencies. There is an issue of how to prepare professionals for them. And I would say that also there is a I just thought that there is not an answer on your question, but in order to understand probably the most important thing which faces public broadcasting in Ukraine is that commercial, private media our sector is too big for Ukraine. It's too large. It's not viable in terms of market, in terms of commercial expedience, because it is run by people who have enough money to run a TV channel, and that TV channel supports them politically. And this is not market, and this is and that private commercial sector, which is not exactly commercial. It's not for earning money. It's about gaining political support. And basically, I think that the most important thing that should be done to normalize the situation is to enforce the rule of law in Ukraine. Because when you have rule of law in the country, the owner of that TV channel, he or she does not need TV channel to defend their property and their political stance, you know. So I think that the most important thing, which is root to successful transition of Ukraine towards a democracy, is increasing the level of rule of law, and it has direct connection to the media situation in my country, including public broadcasting. Sorry, it's a bit far away from your question, but it's very important. And the second question is about international media. I would say that in terms of Ukraine, the most important thing is that all Ukrainians understand Russian. So this is the most important part of the media situation in Ukraine. So Ukrainians, if they want to have a different opinion, they may watch Russian TV channels. Some of the Ukrainian TV channels, they broadcast Russian language product, and it's kind of high quality, and it's done in Ukraine. It's okay, but people still, despite Ukrainian government officially prohibits actually broadcasting of Russian propaganda channels in Ukraine, still many people continue to have access to Russian TV channels via satellites. They can access this information via internet, and this is the most important source of foreign information these days. And unfortunately, as we know, Russian media are not too much preoccupied in delivering balanced opinion. So this is a problem for Ukraine these days, you know, because when we speak about, for example, Voice of America reaching a Ukrainian audience, Voice of America reach Ukrainian TV audience through Ukrainian TV channels, you know. And of course, on the border with Poland, there are viewership for Polish television. But, you know, this is a time when technologies change, and people more and more watch to satellite television, and actually it's not important where you are. Are you closer to the border, or maybe you are in somewhere in central Ukraine? You have access 24 hours per day to internet, and if you want, you can watch. And the most important thing is that I would say Russian propaganda is very powerful on YouTube, because kids, they watch Russian bloggers, young men and women, girls on YouTube, and they simply, that's exactly what is not public broadcasting doing. They are building all those national public broadcasters in the moment when kids watch YouTube, you know? So instead of producing small reels and distribute them across YouTube, they build newsrooms, they build broadcasting towers, which is important. But at the moment, I would say that kids with smartphones are much more important audience for public broadcasting than radio or television.
That's a really interesting point, Kyrylo. I hadn't heard that argument made in the case of Ukraine, although I think it's generally YouTube is underestimated as a media platform. I wanted to ask you really quickly, if I could take the prerogative, and then I have a couple of questions out there, and we'll get back to the audience. But those two questions and your responses to them reminded me of something you said when we sat down to talk about this a couple of weeks ago. You talked about how, on the one hand, Ukrainians have since the collapse of communism, Ukrainians have had much more trust in the private sector than the public sector. And on the other hand, you have a Russian media narrative about the importance of authoritarian government for solving social problems and the inability of democracy to deliver. And that media assault on democracy in Ukraine has been relentless since the invasion. You articulated, I think, really well a role for the public broadcaster in navigating these two extreme and very anti sort of public sector viewpoints. Would you mind sharing with the audience?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for that talk. And actually, if the audience is interested, it's available on the NET website, and it's available. It's actually a Q&A session. Dean and me, and it's about basically the same topic, but somehow I had more time to elaborate some things, and questions were very good. So it was a question about Russian propaganda, and it was a connection to public broadcasting, because in Ukraine the general understanding, general public, it receives the information about situation in Ukraine from the Ukrainian TV channels, which are subordinated to oligarchs who compete for power and money, and Ukrainian audience receives contradictory messages from different sides, and criticizing the government, criticizing oligarchs, and for an average person who just spent her or his day in the office, or I don't know, in the garden, and in the evening you see the situation very complex. When you see a number of channels, you just don't understand whom should I trust, and the person does not have enough time to understand actually what's going on. And then they are accessible to Russian media, and in Russian media everything is in order, because there is a leader of the country who is responsible for everything, and there is a country which there are some problems, but nevertheless the leader gave some like directions, and problems are solved, and vis-a-vis that situation you have Ukraine, which is very democratic. Everything is discussed, everything is discussed in live, and many opinions. And when you see that chaos and order, some people in Crimea and some people in Donbass, they actually started to trust that picture, because when you compare your TV channels, yeah, well, naturally you would choose the order. However, now they have that situation especially in Donbass, because on the TV they still have the picture of order, but when they actually count their wages, they suddenly discover that in Luhansk and Donetsk they receive half less money than across the division line. And this is data from the media in Donbass. So those people in Donetsk, one side, the website, they simply asked people around, how much do you get for as an operator in port in Mariupol, and how much do you get as a miner in Donbass? And you compare, and you see that you have twice less on that Russia-controlled territory. But still, on your TV set, you have order, you have the leader who is wise, who is, and they believe that situation, and they trust that TV screen, and they received actually the situation when they worse off than before. So probably that was my answer when you, it's a bit more than I answered that time actually.
You can't find the whole conversation online. All right, we've got room, I think, for at least a couple more questions. So I know Will had a hand up earlier, and then the woman here with the gold necklace in the second row on this side. And then I see several more hands, so if we can get through those two and have time, I'll return to the audience for one final round. Will, and then the woman in the gold necklace.
Yes, Will Ferrajaro, Strategy for Humanity, Human Rights Consultancy. You seem to mention this in your last comment before Dean's question, but I'm wondering if you could explain a little more about kind of innovative partnerships that the public broadcaster might take. I'm thinking about maybe partnerships with investigative NGOs or let's say right to information actors, historical foundations, things like that that might both enhance the quality of the content but also attract new audiences, particularly across the digital sphere. Thank you.
So should I answer right now?
Let's get both in so we make sure we have time for both.
Martha Chomiak, and it's a related question to the previous one. Many Ukrainian students major in journalism, more even, and a fair number of them go abroad, a lot of exchanges. Is there any relationship between this type of activity and the public sector of the radio and TV? In other words, do the universities offer any help, or do they hinder whatever you're doing?
Yeah, thank you for the questions. In terms of partnerships, there are some partnerships. There are some examples of, there are some content which is produced by some organizations, including our NGO. We produce, we co-produce every day late night show for the Ukrainian radio channel 1. Yeah, so the problem is that there is no mechanism to buy the product from them because the public broadcaster is eager to get it for free and is not ready to pay for this. So in our case, we receive some money from donors, or we receive some money from crowdfunding, and we actually support them with free product. Until the moment we receive the money, it's perfect. But when we are run out of money, we are not able to offer them. And this month, actually, we learned from them that they changed their attitude. We are not able to produce anything which is sponsored by donors to put it on their air. It should be pure volunteering from our side. So we are doing it on our own, and people go to the air as volunteers, and also we get some money from crowdfunding for this. But this is not viable in terms of many years. Before it was permitted to get some money for some particular projects and put it on the air. Now it's not. So the problem is not about creativity, I would say, but the problem is about management and about logic and how it should be viable in long term. You know, how it's about internal regulations. It's about the budget they can assign for this, and it's about budget that they can hire people, you know. And this is an answer for your question, Martha. Those bright young people who came to the United States or Europe and came back with good education and some some dreams to fulfill, they need to buy flat, you know, and they need to survive. And that's why they go to commercial channel. When I was a young student, actually, and I came back to Ukraine, I went to commercial channel because I wanted to sustain myself. Now, when I'm established a little bit, I decided that I can move to public sector. Yeah, so this is again, it's a question about how public service media are able to be sustainable. I think this is the most crucial problem as of now, how to compete with commercial media in terms of organization of production, in terms of financial mechanism, in terms of how you will work, how you secure your future as a public broadcaster in 3 years, in 5 years. Because for my organization, it's a tiny, small, non-government organization. Like 3 years ago, 4 years ago, we were just happy that we just popped up, we exist, you know. And now it's a question, how will we survive? How will we be useful in 5 years? How will be sustainable? So it's about how should we organize that unit inside our organization, which will market our product. How will we sustain? How will we organize our advertising sales? It's something like that.
I know Joanna had a comment on that as well.
I mean, it's been the dilemma what to do with all of the journalists that have been trained either abroad. I mean, some of the organizations that we work with, you know, make the point that dozens of universities pump out hundreds of graduates, and apparently the journalism faculty is one of the most popular directions in Ukraine right now. And the difficulty is there's really nowhere for them to work. With the best intentions, they go to newsrooms that have, how would you say, somewhat lower ethical standards than you would hope to. And this is already coming out of journalism programs that don't emphasize journalism ethics, fact-checking, and all the rest of it. So as much as our colleagues who do work media development program, journalism training programs, it still leaves the dilemma that they don't really have a place to work. Our approach has actually been to work with newsrooms, whether they're regional newsrooms, some on the national level, that show a willingness to increase journalism standards in-house and actually exchange journalists among them so that these young people do have a place to work. But again, it's a drop in the bucket compared to what's out there.
All right, we have just a few minutes. I'm going to very quickly take 2 more questions, and then if we can give very concise answers, Kyrylo, because I want to be respectful of everyone's time as well. But okay. So we've got someone here in the 3rd row back, a young woman in glasses, and then I think this gentleman halfway down in the blue shirt and suit has been had his hand up the last several times. So first with the young lady, and oh, well, you're there, so whoever gets there first, it's a race.
Yes, it's been a few years since I was there, but at the same time I've worked with OSCE on several missions in Ukraine, in several of the oblasts of provinces. And when talking to ordinary Ukrainian citizens, one of the most frequent concerns that they express, and I was in, of course, the southern part of Ukraine, was concerns about corruption. And could you comment on how the media is dealing with those concerns?
Yep, thank you.
Yeah, and then we'll bundle them with...
Thank you. I know that you, Kyrylo, is a really reputable media representative from Ukraine. And so if you acknowledge the situation with the problem, with the challenges in the PBC system, right? What exactly the steps did you do to improve it? And actually, in communication with Ukrainian government, for example, as you told, to improve the law on PBC system. So what steps did you do?
Okay, thank you. I will try to be short. The first question is really very simple. Ukrainian media all the time they report about corruption. All the audience is aware about corruption. However, the investigative journalism, providing such a mass of examples, it does not reach the goal because the law enforcement is not always ready to actually make it to investigate it and to reach some results. So basically, it's again we see the problem with the rule of law. When we have plenty of accusations, we have some good investigative journalism cases, and the law enforcers either are overwhelmed with number of such cases or simply ineffective, which is even probably a better explanation. But in reality, despite the journalists, they provide plenty of information, it's not the situation when all those investigations end up with investigations from law enforcement. So about public broadcasting company in Ukraine, this is again, I'm not able to answer this short. I'm sorry. I don't know, it's basically a topic for another 20 or 30 minutes. I'm sorry. Maybe I will answer it personally afterward. We definitely do. Well, as I'm doing this research, I consult some people in the government. So this is probably the best answer. But in order to reach the government, in order to have this communication done, you know, this small organization, you need to have government relations department. We don't have this. So this is a problem that. Yes, we visited Ministry of Information Policies and we talked to them and we basically asked them, maybe you will support our broadcasting. And they said, okay, this time probably not because we have no funds. So basically this is an explanation.
I mean, I don't think it's so much a matter of the government. It depends on who you're talking about. I mean, there's an interplay between what the executive is, but there's also the legislative part of it. So, I mean, a budget has to be passed and adopted by the parliament. And if they refuse to do so or give a sufficient amount of money, then that is a political problem within the parliamentarians, not so much within this individual ministries or the government of Ukraine itself. So I don't think Kyrylo in any way was suggesting that it's a problem with the Ukrainian government per se. It's a larger problem in terms of what the interplay is between the government commitments that they have made to supporting the public entity and the political actors around the government that actually have to pass the bills and pass the budgets in order to make that happen. So if there's a disconnect between the two, then the whole system blocks up. So I don't think that it's casting aspersions on the Ukrainian government per se, but it's also only one example of where the international commitments that it has made is being somewhat fouled, as it were, by the dysfunctions within the political system writ large.
All right, everybody. I'm afraid that's all we have time for. You have been a wonderful audience, very engaged, good questions. Thanks so much for coming. Thanks to Kyrylo and Joanna.